These days, Sonic the Hedgehog is a familiar sight on Nintendo consoles. Seeing the blue blur stood side by side with Mario feels somewhat natural. I mean, the pair have even hosted an entire series of Olympic Games together at this point. That wasn't always the case, however. Today, we look back at one of gaming's most public battles right from the very beginning to understand how this complicated relationship came to be. The year was 1985. The North American gaming industry was in complete disarray after the video game market crash of 1983, and retailers flooded to CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, to see Nintendo unveil the Famicom's American debut. Now named the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo tried their best in pitching the console to the understandably hesitant retailers of the time. When very few were keen on the prospect of purchasing units, Nintendo gave them a risk-free deal. Agree to purchase our console, and we'll buy any unsold units back. That same year, on October 18th, Nintendo released 100,000 NES units to a limited number of retailers. Included with the console, Nintendo bundled in Super Mario Bros., a decision that boosted sales massively. When we talk about that idea of system sellers, this was certainly one of them, with an estimated 90% of that first batch selling. With such promising signs of success in its early release, it's only natural that Nintendo went on to a wider console release in February 1986 across North America and Canada, launching with over 15 titles, including the likes of Duck Hunt and Ice Climber. In the time that followed, in that period of the mid to late 80s, the NES ran the North American video game market, and Nintendo were the top dog, accounting for 90% of the US video game sector by 1990 following the massive success of releases like The Legend of Zelda and Metroid, establishing important IP that would go on to be household names.
It may be the most addictive toy in history, and it's definitely the hottest thing this Christmas. Nintendo video games. They first arrived from Japan 3 years ago, and now millions of American kids are hooked and mesmerized. When they do stop to talk, it's in a language only they understand.
By the late 80s, Sega had also made unsuccessful attempts of their own at shaking up the home console market with the Master System. But they were only now ramping up a plan that would see them drastically increase their market share. After the middling performance of the Master System, Sega set out to create a new console that would be at least as powerful as the other 16-bit consoles that were now entering the market. Named the Mega Drive in most countries, Sega wanted to associate their latest machine with superiority in power, only for a trademark dispute to lead to the console being redubbed the Genesis for the North American market. After its nationwide North American release on September 15, 1989, the Genesis initially struggled to compete with the NES, even with its superior technical capabilities, because Nintendo had already established themselves as the console for the whole family. Sega decided to shift their marketing. If they're struggling to make a name for themselves in family entertainment, they'll target those outside of it, shifting their strategy so that the Genesis was marketed towards an older target audience. In particular, Sega were trying to win an audience of older teens and younger men, as people with their first jobs were probably more likely to spend more disposable income because they don't have families to provide for, and some might not even have any bills at all. Software-wise, Sega began to produce maturer content, releasing games like Altered Beast and the Phantasy Star games. They marketed their new identity with the infamous tag, Genesis does what Nintendo don't. After further struggles in both North America and Japan, it became clear that Sega's problem wasn't their audience, nor was it their hardware. It was their IP. Nintendo had found the perfect company mascot in Mario, a character that was a near instant hit with families, but Sega was struggling to find the same. Their earlier attempts with Alex Kidd never seemed to land right, and they simply didn't have an IP of their own that could be considered a system seller. Sega set their main focus on creating a company mascot that would rival Nintendo's Mario. The R&D department supposedly submitted several concepts, including a wolf, a bulldog, a robot and a warrior, but they decided to focus on speed, inspired by programmer Yuji Naka's attempts to complete the first Mario level as fast as possible. This eventually narrowed their search onto looking for animals that could roll into a ball, settling on a Hedgehog character as drawn by Naoto Oshima. Sonic's original name was simply Mr. Hedgehog, before they decided on the name we all know and love because of his speedy nature. In early designs, Sonic was actually teal, but he was changed to dark blue to be reflective of the Sega company colours. His ability to spin while jumping was given to him so that the player could both attack and jump within the same button press, and he was unable to swim purely because Naka mistakenly assumed Hedgehogs couldn't. In terms of designing Sonic's debut game, the developers wanting to create something modern and cool were paying attention to the current boom in environmental awareness and eco-friendly attitudes that was happening in the early moments of the 90s. They went on to bake that culture shift into the game directly, with Sonic's battles to free woodland creatures from mechs and robots being based on the idea of nature versus environmental development. In 1991, knowing the Nintendo's NES successor, the Super Nintendo, was on the horizon, Sega, specifically in America, took a big risk to position themselves as strong competitors, not just against the NES, but against the upcoming SNES too. They had all of their eggs in the Sonic the Hedgehog basket, and so it shocked some when Sega of America made the decision not only to slash the price of the Genesis, but also to bundle Sonic the Hedgehog in with it. The Genesis was now priced at $149, undercutting Nintendo's upcoming SNES, which was launching at $199, and the new bundle promised consumers the experience of one of the system's best titles completely free. The value these decisions brought to the Genesis was massive. With this aggressive strategy, Sega managed to gain a significant share of the US market, and by 1992 held the majority share over Nintendo for the very first time. With gamers high on Sega's new spiky blue mascot, Sega began development on 2 further Sonic games. Programmer Yuji Naka had actually left Sega of Japan after growing dissatisfied months before Sonic 1 even released. Mark Cerny, an American video game designer, launched the Sega Technical Institute in the US. Cerny had heard about Naka's situation and met with him, ultimately managing to convince him to rejoin Sega at the STI, away from Sega of Japan's critiques, and with an improved salary. This move led to a few members of Sonic Team joining Naka in the US. Sega of Japan put those who stayed to work on developing Sonic the Hedgehog CD for their upcoming Genesis add-on, the Sega CD. Cerny and Naka originally worked on other original titles after a failed pitch for a Sonic sequel, before Sega's superiors then frantically changed their mind, putting them to the task on Sonic the Hedgehog 2 with a mere 11 months of development time before a scheduled worldwide release date, something which was historic at the time. With the rush, some of the Japanese developers working on the game actually couldn't work on it till much later on, because they were still dealing with visa complications. Despite a problematic and rushed development, along with lots of scrap content, the game made its release date of Tuesday the 24th of November 1992, a date now known as Sonic Tuesday. The game released to great critical acclaim and was the highest selling game of 1992, despite only releasing with a month left of the calendar year. The success of Sonic 2 came at an important time for the company. After being dethroned in the US market, Nintendo were no longer underestimating Sega as a rival. This was now war. Despite losing their hold on the market in early 1992, by late 1992 and going into 1993, Nintendo gained traction in their race to take it back. Despite the SNES's initial loss to the Genesis, Nintendo released a number of system-selling exclusives throughout 1992 to great success, such as The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past and Street Fighter II, the latter in particular being a monumental success. Nintendo's continued commitment to family-friendly games like The Legend of Zelda ensured that they were still the #1 choice for families, while Sega's aggressive marketing towards adults and older teens was successful in winning them an audience of their own. It also worked against them, as families would sometimes fear the edgier games the system promoted as having a negative impact on their children. This sentiment was echoed by the controversy surrounding the release of Mortal Kombat. The game launched for both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo at great success with its violent gameplay and trademark fatalities, but there was one key difference to the way the game was presented on each console. The Genesis version included gore while the SNES version censored it. Sega weren't shy about it either, turning the gore into another point of marketing their Genesis does what Nintendo don't slogan. The violence and gore in games like Mortal Kombat, however, led to massive backlash from parents and politicians alike. Enough backlash that the US Senate actually held hearings in 1993 to take a look at the impact of violent games on children.
Maybe you will be brain dead from staring at this thing all the time.
No.
Both Sega and Nintendo fell under the microscope in the hearings, but Sega more so because of their aggressive marketing of mature content. These hearings led to the conception of the ESRB. Over 1992 and going into 1994, Sega also lost market share because of their focus on prolonging the life of the Genesis through expensive add-ons. The Sega CD released in 1992 at a price of $299, and went on to minimal software support outside of Sonic CD, only for Sega to release another Genesis add-on in 1994 with the Sega 32X. However, by this point, consumers were already ready and expecting the next Sega console, so there was little to no interest. Sega's focus on add-ons confused and frustrated consumers who felt as though they were forking out cash for hardware that Sega would only go on and make obsolete months later. Where Sega focused on hardware add-ons, Nintendo had been continually churning out massive software hits, while also maintaining strong third-party support, both of which giving the Super Nintendo a vast and varied library of some of the best titles gaming had to offer at the time. In 1994, Nintendo had the company Rare develop a new take on Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Country. All eyes were glued to the game's pre-rendered graphics that rivaled anything on the Genesis despite still using the Super Nintendo tech. The game boosted SNES sales dramatically despite the 16-bit era of gaming already coming to a close, which was a massive surprise win for Nintendo, who were already focused on developing their next console. With Nintendo having made up ground in the console war again, all focus was on the next generation of gaming, where things were really ramping up in the hardware market. Sega had already been developing their next console for quite some time. Originally, the Sega Saturn was intended to be a 2D gaming powerhouse that would run arcade-quality games in the home. However, midway through development, as the industry shifted towards 3D, Sega decided to shift gears with it, hurriedly re-engineering the console they had already been developing for some time to then have 3D capability too. In 1995, under pressure with a new player about to enter the console war in Sony, Sega rushed the Saturn's US launch, surprise launching the console 4 months ahead of schedule. Retailers who were left completely underprepared were shocked and angry, and consumers weren't exactly chomping at the bit either. The console was launched at a price of $399, pricing many consumers out of even considering a purchase. While the Saturn did clearly excel with 2D games, Virtua Fighter being notably successful on the system, the rushed decision to re-engineer the system for the 3D market meant that the hardware was so convoluted that third-party developers were struggling to create games for the system, and thus third-party support was minimal. The Saturn didn't even have a 3D Sonic title to sell the system at launch. Furthermore, the Saturn's high price point became a huge point of failure as soon as Sony entered the US market with the PlayStation a few months later, a system which was $100 cheaper than the Saturn. The PlayStation's development was an interesting product of the console war. Originally, Sony were collaborating with Nintendo to create a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, like Sega had done with the Sega CD. The partnership fell apart, prompting Sony to decide to use their own experience in consumer electronics to begin development on a console of their own. The PlayStation was built from the ground up, entirely with 3D gaming in mind. For its US launch, Sony actually used Sega's own marketing strategy against themselves, aggressively targeting older gamers. Not only were they undercutting Sega by $100, but they were undercutting them with the same target audience, giving them a massive advantage. While the PlayStation didn't have first-party franchises like Sega or Nintendo, they didn't have a Sonic nor a Mario, the system was seen as developer-friendly compared to the convoluted hardware of the Saturn, and so it attracted many third-party studios that developed era-defining games for the system. Titles like Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Tomb Raider and Resident Evil ensured the PlayStation was a huge success, and it went on to dominate the console market, selling over 102 million units. Nintendo were a little delayed in entering the 3D era. Assumedly learning from Sega's rushed mistakes with the Saturn, the Nintendo 64 didn't release until a year later in 1996. Furthermore, contrary to Sega releasing the Saturn without a 3D Sonic game at launch, the N64 launched with Super Mario 64, a revolutionary game that set a whole new standard for 3D platformers at the time. This first-party support continued throughout the console's lifespan, with Nintendo releasing huge games like Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye and Smash Bros on the system to great success with their audience.
Jingle bells, else, Christmas really stunk. I got nothing that I like, my gifts were all just junk.
Boxes full of clothes,
CDs no one knows. When I wanted something for my Nintendo 64. Zelda's great, Turok 2, South Park would be fine. How about Rogue Squadron? That game should be mine.
Make up for a lame Christmas. Get the hits you missed on N64.
But that was also the problem. The N64 was great at appealing to Nintendo's pre-established audience, but the system still used cartridges, which were not only more expensive to produce, but also offered significantly less storage than CDs did, and so many third-party developers ditched Nintendo to support the PlayStation instead, meaning the N64 didn't appeal to anyone new that wasn't already brand loyal to Nintendo themselves. It's not like this was a doom and gloom console, the N64 was still successful, selling over 32 million units and maintaining Nintendo's profitability. But the lack of third-party support allowed Sony to immediately take hold of the market as soon as they entered it. Nintendo might not have been the industry leaders any longer, but learning from the Saturn's mistakes, they still established themselves a much healthier share of the market than Sega now had, marking the start of the end of Sega's time in the hardware market. Sega was struggling massively. After failure after failure, the company set their sights on one more last-ditch effort in the hardware market. The goal was simple. Not only this time did Sega want to create a system that was powerful, but furthermore, after the pricing failure of the Saturn, it was important to create a system that was affordable. The result was the Dreamcast, a system historic for being one of, if not the first home console with online capabilities. Like I said, Sega weren't here to make the same mistakes again. They'd learned from the Saturn, and they weren't going to launch a new console without the presence of their speedy mascot. The Dreamcast launched in the US in late 1999 alongside a game that would go on to change Sonic forever. A little game called Sonic Adventure. Sonic Adventure was actually originally in development for the Saturn, but when Sega began work on the Dreamcast, it became clear to the dev team that the project should be moved to the new console in the name of graphical quality. Because the game was in development alongside the Dreamcast, the developers of the game also actually had an opportunity to influence the design of the Dreamcast itself, thus building a Sonic game that would essentially act as a showcase of the potential the system could offer. One example being Chaos, as Sega wanted something liquid and transparent to show what the Dreamcast was capable of graphically. This wasn't the first time Sonic had been 3D, but it was the first full-scale attempt at a mainline 3D Sonic game, so it posed interesting new challenges for the dev team. Because of Sonic's focus on speed, the team found they had to make larger maps than was standard in gaming at the time. Furthermore, Adventure became the first time there was voice acting for all of the cast. The game released to massive praise for its ambition and was a huge success, selling over 2.5 million copies and ensuring the Dreamcast's success in the short term, with the system selling 500,000 units in its first 2 weeks in the US. That same year, Sony delivered the killing blow in announcing the PlayStation 2. The system was massively consumer-friendly by comparison. Not only could you still play your old PlayStation games as the system was backwards compatible, but it also alleviated the need for a DVD player in the home as it could play DVDs itself. These consumer-friendly promises, alongside the failures of the Sega Saturn and the Genesis add-ons, meant that when the Dreamcast was released, a lot of consumers just decided to wait until 2000 to opt for the PlayStation 2 instead. The Dreamcast was still relatively successful, selling over 9 million units, but the last decade had taken too much of a toll on the company. Prior losses rendered the success inconsequential, as Sega still couldn't make themselves profitable. Thus, in 2001, Sega announced they would discontinue the Dreamcast and exit the console market entirely, shifting their sole focus to software development. One of the last major releases for the Dreamcast came a few months after the announcement, a swan song of sorts. In celebration of Sonic's 10th anniversary, Sega released Sonic Adventure 2, a sequel focused on improving its predecessor's gameplay and story. The game changed Sonic forever, introducing us to Shadow the Hedgehog, a character whose cultural impact could never have been predicted. The game was one of Sonic's biggest ever successes, and has long been considered one of the best entries in the franchise by fans. With Sega going software only though, what consoles would Sonic go on to call home? Up until Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast, Nintendo had still been supporting their previous generation console, the N64, and were simply observing the hardware market to plan out their next move. Later in 2001, they made that move, releasing the Nintendo GameCube. Their new console was designed with developers in mind due to Sony's current dominance on third-party titles. It didn't quite match the consumer-friendly nature of the PlayStation 2, the GameCube used mini-discs rather than CDs and thus couldn't be used as an all-in-one home entertainment device, but Nintendo were no longer aiming to dominate the market again. The PlayStation 2 was so successful that seemed impossible. They were simply here to compete and survive through their first-party games and dedicated fanbase. The system launched with fan-favourite titles like Luigi's Mansion, and Nintendo's first-party consistency continued throughout this era with games like Melee finding a home on the system. The GameCube for Nintendo was merely a modest success, but in comparison to the Dreamcast, it sold over double the units. It was successful, in the sense that the system allowed Nintendo to maintain their dedicated fanbase with massive first-party hits, but unfortunately, Nintendo's plan to make the system developer-friendly didn't make a huge difference to third-party developers, because the GameCube launched too closely to Microsoft's Xbox entering the console market, a system which had similar enough engineering and architecture to the PlayStation 2 that developers found it more cost-effective to develop for both PS2 and Xbox over GameCube. After exiting the hardware market, Sega had to think carefully about where Sonic would go next. And with the GameCube releasing just as they were transitioning to third-party game development, it seemed like their once mortal enemy of Nintendo was actually the next logical step. Not only was the system releasing at the perfect time, but there was also some degree of audience synergy. Although Sega initially pushed Sonic as edgy and for older kids, Sonic had grown to appeal to a wide range of ages. In particular, he was popular with the same younger demographic that Nintendo's Mario was popular with due to his appearance in Saturday morning cartoons. Thus, in 2002, Sega released Sonic Adventure 2 Battle for the GameCube. It wasn't as simple as a port over to Nintendo's system. The game featured improved textures and models along with a revamped multiplayer mode. This was history making. The two companies had been at war for so long and so aggressively publicly in their marketing that Sonic appearing on a Nintendo system was a huge shock to the industry. But the decision paid off. Sonic Adventure 2 Battle sold so well that it became one of the best-selling third-party games on the GameCube. And it helped prove to the Sega hierarchy that transitioning to software development was indeed going to be a sustainable business model. The success of the game also massively strengthened Nintendo and Sega's relationship following their decade-long battle. Once enemies, they now considered each other friends, and Sonic appearing on Nintendo systems began to just make sense. Sonic would go on to appear across many platforms, the PlayStation, Xbox, and even mobile, but Nintendo became a key partner of sorts. This relationship forming became almost immediately evident with the Sonic Advance games, a series of 2D platforming Sonic games that were developed and subsequently released exclusively for the Nintendo Game Boy Advance systems from 2002 to 2004. The trilogy of games was received very well, with the second even introducing Cream the Rabbit to the franchise. In the midst of this series, Sega increased Sonic's presence on the GBA even further with the release of the fighting game spin-off Sonic Battle. If you want to know more about this game, I made a video about it already on my channel. That game was received admittedly not quite as well as the Advance games, but not poorly by any means. In 2003, Sega released Sonic's next mainline 3D outing, Sonic Heroes. The game was Sonic's first ever multi-platform title, releasing for the GameCube, the PS2 and the Xbox. Heroes was actually my first ever Sonic game, and although it's understandably controversial with its repetitive nature, I loved it and the team mechanic. 2 years later, Shadow the Hedgehog came to that same set of systems. These two weren't the only multi-platform games of this era, there was also Sonic Riders, but these were major releases that highlighted Sega's willingness to now release Sonic titles on all major platforms. That being said, these titles also proved Nintendo was Sega's key partner, as the GameCube versions of the games were better optimized with smoother frame rates and better visuals. Sonic also continued to shine on Nintendo's handheld consoles, with Sonic Rush releasing to great critical acclaim for the Nintendo DS in 2005, introducing the boost mechanic and Blaze the Cat to the franchise. By all accounts, Nintendo's systems became the definitive way to play Sonic games. It was weird then that in 2006, for Sonic's 15th anniversary, Sega set their sights on rebooting Sonic completely, only to not release it on Nintendo's new console at the time, the Nintendo Wii. The Wii was one of Nintendo's biggest hardware successes, reshaping the way games were played at the time. When developing the console, Nintendo wanted to develop a system that was more accessible to those outside of the traditional gaming audience. The Wii's focus on active and physical gameplay through the motion controls of the Wiimote was revolutionary at the time, and it made the system a massive hit with every member of the family. Unlike the Wii's competitors of the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, the Wii focused less on high-end hardware improvements in favour of innovation, and hence the system wasn't quite as capable as the rest of its generation. Because of this though, the Wii was priced significantly cheaper than its competitors, at only $250 as opposed to the almost $500 price tags of the 360 and the PS3. When rebooting Sonic, Sega wanted to bring the blue anthropomorphic hedgehog to a more realistic 3D world, with a maturer tone and next generation visuals, which then essentially ruled out the Wii as a platform because of its hardware limitations. However, Sega weren't just going to give up on Nintendo after all they'd been through, splitting the dev team of Sonic 06 in half mid-development to have a Wii exclusive title developed. This change of staff was not the only reason Sonic 06 failed, but it definitely contributed, as the game infamously released with a plague of bugs and to major criticism. The team assigned to the Wii exclusive title went on to develop Sonic and the Secret Rings, a storybook-based title that fully utilised everything that made the Wii so unique, with its motion controls and the storybook nature appealing more to the family-friendly audience of the Wii. The game released to much stronger reviews than Sonic 06 and marked the start of an interesting period that brought Sega and Nintendo even closer together again. Sega went on to release Sonic Rush Adventure for the DS in that same year of 2007, a sequel that expanded on its predecessor by continuing the story of Blaze with a bigger focus now on exploration. Secret Rings and Rush Adventure weren't actually the most interesting Sonic appearances on Nintendo hardware in 2007 though. In 2007, with oversight from Nintendo, Sega developed a game in partnership with the International Olympic Committee that would go on to make history. Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games was instantly iconic, with gaming's two biggest rivals appearing alongside each other for the very first time, on the bizarre neutral ground of the Olympic Games, with the kind of party minigame mechanics that were popular with families on the Nintendo Wii. The game released exclusively on Nintendo consoles with a version for the Wii and a version for the DS. The Wii game featured motion control based minigames where the DS swapped motion controls for touchscreen controls. The game was a huge success commercially, selling over 10 million copies and spawning a franchise that went on to continue until the 2020 Olympics 5 years ago. Critically, the game was received generally positively, with reviews sometimes deeming it a little mediocre. With the sales numbers, it's clear that associating Sonic with a beloved character like Mario was beneficial in repairing the Blue Blair's reputation after the howler of Sonic 06. And Sonic also started making appearances in the Super Smash Bros. Games when he came to Brawl in 2008. The Olympic Games appearance helped Sonic establish himself an even bigger audience on the Wii, and thus his next mainline 3D outing after Sonic 06, Sonic Unleashed, was released for the Wii in 2008 alongside its Xbox and PlayStation versions. The game was slightly different on Wii and PlayStation 2 compared to PS3 and Xbox to accommodate the hardware, but Sega were clearly showing intent to make mainline Sonic a mainstay on Nintendo systems regardless. Also in 2008, BioWare developed a Sonic RPG for the DS known as Sonic Chronicles: The Dark Brotherhood. The game used turn-based combat and a unique storyline, and was released to mixed reviews, mainly due to its pacing. However, it did prove once more that Sega were willing to get experimental with Sonic on Nintendo consoles, whether that's through playing with the motion controls of the Wii or simply testing interesting new ideas with the smaller handheld titles. Another Sonic Riders game released this year, Sonic Riders Zero Gravity, and again it released on multiple consoles. However, the Wii version certainly did stand out because of the motion controls. In 2009, Sega made another Wii exclusive Sonic spin-off, a direct sequel to Sonic and the Secret Rings, Sonic and the Black Knight. Sonic and the Black Knight used the motion controls of the Wii to have Sonic swing a sword, not too dissimilar to the approach the Legend of Zelda series would go on to take a few years later with Skyward Sword. Admittedly, the game didn't exactly set the world alight, as it came under fire for its action-heavy nature, slowing Sonic down. In 2010 though, Sega proved their commitment and belief in Nintendo as the perfect destination for Sonic by releasing the next mainline adventure exclusively on Nintendo Wii and Nintendo DS. Sonic Colors aimed to combine classic 2D Sonic platforming with modern 3D Sonic gameplay. After the controversial receptions of Unleashed and 06, Sega wanted to avoid trying anything too ambitious both narratively and mechanic-wise, and thus the game released with a rather linear, light-hearted narrative that appealed more to younger audiences with its comedic tone. The DS version differed a little from the Wii version, in that it played more akin to Sonic Rush. The modern 3D segments of the Wii title were swapped for Rush-style 2D gameplay. Both versions released to critical acclaim, and Colors was overall considered a return to form for the franchise after the disappointments of the last two mainline outings. By the time the next mainline Sonic game was in development, Nintendo had moved on from the DS to the 3DS. With a more powerful handheld port now an option, Sonic Generations abandoned the Wii to release only on the PC, PS3, 360 and 3DS. Generations was another anniversary title, this time celebrating 20 years of Sonic. Like Colors, the home console release was different to the handheld version, in that the 3DS version was exclusively 2D based instead of featuring 3D gameplay, and despite getting slightly less positive reviews than its home console counterpart, was generally received well. There was a real excitement amongst the Sonic fanbase for the feature now, and it really seemed like Sega had put their mascot back on the right track. 1 year after the release of Generations, Nintendo released their latest hardware evolution, the Wii U. The console was Nintendo's first system capable of 1080p visuals and featured a new kind of controller, the Wii U gamepad, a tablet-like second-screen controller that now looks a bit like an uninvolved Nintendo Switch. The system was a huge failure on Nintendo's part, especially following the success of the Wii. The naming and the marketing being focused more on the gamepad than the console itself confused consumers into thinking it was simply an expensive controller add-on for the original Wii, and the system ended up being Nintendo's lowest selling home console of all time. With lesser hardware than its competitors, the Wii U struggled when it came to third-party support, at a time when Sega were also going through financial challenges of their own and needed a stable revenue stream. Thus, a new exclusivity deal for Sonic on Nintendo systems was struck up between the two companies. The deal was for 3 titles, keeping Sonic off Nintendo's competitor systems for quite some time. The first title of the deal was none other than Sonic Lost World, which released for both Wii U and 3DS in 2013. Lost World was heavily inspired by the Mario Galaxy games, using spherical and cylindrical level design. The game also used the Wisps from Sonic Colors again. As the first game in a historic exclusivity deal, fans were a little underwhelmed. The game wasn't received poorly, it was just mediocre, and a big step back compared to the highs of Generations and Colors. The game was praised for its art direction, everything looked vibrant and colourful, and the game was generally easy on the eyes. However, Sonic's movement felt too slow and clunky for a Hedgehog that rolls around at the speed of sound, and the level design was massively inconsistent. Some stages were fun, the others a dull bore. Much like previous titles, the 3DS version of Lost World was scaled back by comparison to the Wii U version, though unlike Generations, this port retained some 3D elements, though it was definitely still more 2D focused. Despite that 2D focus providing more of a traditional Sonic experience, neither version of the game was more impressive than the other, with Lost World overall being considered a forgettable misstep for the franchise. The next title of the exclusivity deal was a little confusing. Mario and Sonic at the Sochi 2014 Olympic Winter Games released for the Wii U. The Mario and Sonic games were always consistent in what they offered and thus would always be a safe bet for consistent sales. But it's a little confusing as to why either party allowed for this to be part of the exclusivity deal. This series was already exclusive to begin with. It's not like they wouldn't have made the game without the deal either, because they still had the separate deal for the license of the Olympics to make use of. This was an expected, unsurprising release that didn't offend nor did it do anything spectacular. It just seems like a huge missed opportunity for this to have taken the slot of another potential exclusive. Sega's next move was one of their weirdest ever. They wanted to modernise Sonic and make the characters appeal more to younger audiences. And so they decided to create and spend a number of years focusing on a spin-off universe within the Sonic franchise that would specifically cater to Western audiences. They produced an animated TV show, Sonic Boom. It was actually pretty solid. It focused on humour and it was really actually quite funny. But Sega didn't want Boom to just be a TV series. They wanted Boom to be Sonic for a while, and began developing the next titles of the exclusivity deal within the Boom universe. Boom was controversial for a number of reasons, like the character redesigns and the subpar toy line, but none more so than the tie-in video games. Sega put 2 Sonic Boom games into development, one for the Wii U and one for the 3DS, but they themselves didn't actually develop either. Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric for the Wii U was developed by Big Red Button Entertainment. This decision was weird for a multitude of reasons, but the main one being that this is the first game the studio ever developed. Supposedly they were chosen because some of the team were ex-Naughty Dog, and Sega thought appealing to Western audiences meant making a Sonic game that was more action-adventure focused like Uncharted. Developed to release alongside Rise of Lyric was Sonic Boom Shattered Crystal for the 3DS, yet another game that was not developed by Sega themselves, this time developed by Sanzaru Games. Sanzaru Games, however, were a slightly more experienced studio, who were just coming off the back of developing Sly Cooper Thieves in Time. Rise of Lyric was developed as a third-person action-adventure game akin to Jak and Daxter, with a new focus on exploration and puzzle solving. Interestingly, Sonic, Tails, Knuckles and Amy were all playable, each with unique abilities for puzzle solving. This might have sounded interesting on a piece of paper in Sega's office, but it did not turn out to be. The game was both a critical and commercial failure. Reviews were terrible. The game released with bugs galore and frame rate drops that made players feel like they were walking through sludge. Similarly to Lost World, this game slowed Sonic down too much. Levels were dull and slow and not at all anything like the Sonic that fans knew and loved. Shattered Crystal was also received poorly, though nowhere near as poorly as Rise of Lyric. The game was a 2D side-scroller with a pseudo-Metroidvania approach, wherein the player could unlock paths forward by revisiting previous levels, this time as different characters. Critics again found the gameplay too slow for a character like Sonic, but worse, repetitive, making the game just feel a bit tedious. Interestingly, Shattered Crystal somehow spawned a sequel, Fire and Ice, again for the 3DS. Fire and Ice was an incredibly similarly designed game, this time with the introduction of fire and ice powers, if you can believe that. The game was received better than its predecessor with more polish overall, but it was still painfully mediocre. The Boom games were a huge failure. It seemed like Sega simply didn't know what Sonic fans wanted anymore. The games became some of the worst selling in the franchise's history and had a significant impact on Sega's reputation, especially online. Concluding Sega and Nintendo's exclusivity deal, Sega decided to refocus back on producing more traditional Sonic games, and started exclusively working with teams who were already experienced with the Blue Hedgehog. This brings us almost up to speed with our time. Over the last decade, Sega stopped prioritizing Nintendo hardware and began making Sonic multi-platform again, with its games now regularly releasing on all consoles and PC. There's also been no handheld specific games since Fire and Ice, because the idea of the handheld itself shifted forever with Nintendo's next console, the Nintendo Switch. Now handhelds are only a little less powerful than recent home console generations, so there was no longer a need for scaled back versions of mainline games for them. Sonic games have been consistently inconsistent since Boom. Sonic Mania was a big hit, but it was followed by a big failure with Forces. Sonic Colors Ultimate and Sonic Origins remastered older Sonic titles and resold them at controversially high prices. In recent years, Sonic Frontiers changed the way Sonic games could play while still retaining Sonic's speed, and was generally received positively, but it was then followed by Sonic Superstars, a more traditional classic 2D Sonic outing that, although received positively at the time, seems to have settled with a bit of a mediocre reputation. Last year though, Sega remastered Sonic Generations, this time including a brand new Shadow Generations game to massive acclaim from both fans and critics. I skip over all of these so quickly because I have another video focusing specifically on these Sonic games and their appearance on Nintendo Switch coming out soon, but I feel it's important to mention, especially in regards to Sonic's relationship with Nintendo, that the Switch ports of these games have always just been as inconsistent as the games themselves. Some ports have been great, Shadow Generations plays pretty well, so does Superstars and Mania and Origins too, albeit with visual downgrades because of the hardware limitations, but other titles have been an entirely different story. Sonic Colors Ultimate, the original exclusive to the Nintendo Wii, was now riddled with so many issues on the Nintendo Switch on release that some deemed it a health hazard to play because it would sometimes glitch into a mess of flashing light and colour. Furthermore, Sonic Frontiers struggled massively on Switch. The open world game had pop-in issues on most platforms, but on Switch those issues were tenfold. Nintendo have gone from being Sega's biggest competitor, with Sonic and Mario being huge public rivals, to the definitive place to play Sonic, to now probably being the worst way to play Sonic. Sonic and Nintendo have a long, extensively historied relationship that shifted dynamics so many times, but as someone who grew up during the Wii and DS era, Nintendo and Sonic being together is something that has always just sort of made sense to me. I hope with the upcoming Nintendo Switch 2, Sonic games will be better optimised for the system and Nintendo will once again become a key partner for Sega. That being said, with such a long and complicated relationship, who's to say where Nintendo and Sonic will go next? Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm really sorry it took so long. I've been swamped with work lately and it was also just my birthday, and I wanted this video to be longer than the rest because of the amount of history to touch on. I'm hoping to be more consistent with uploads from now on, so if you liked what you saw today and you aren't already, please do subscribe. The support means a lot. If you made it this far, let me know by telling me down below how you feel about Sonic and Nintendo. Do you like Sonic and Nintendo as a partnership, or do you miss when Sega and Nintendo were mortal enemies? I'd love to hear your thoughts.